Hello everyone, and welcome to D&D Academy's lesson on attacks, and the different kinds of attacks that exist in D&D 5e. So the first two categories we want to go over are weapon attacks and spell attacks. Weapon attacks typically use your strength or dex modifier, dex in the case of ranged or finesse weapons. This is of course excluding things that will substitute in your charisma, intelligence, or wisdom modifier through the use of whether it be shillelagh, hexblade, Astral Self Monk, or the subclasses or features. Weapon attacks are usually the default. If something is not listed as a spell attack, it's almost always a weapon attack. And then, of course, the one thing to keep in mind is that weapon attacks do not always involve weapons. This is very important and will come in handy later. Spell attacks, on the other hand, typically use your spellcasting modifier, the charisma dex, or charisma, wisdom, and intelligence, and they will almost always explicitly mention being a spell attack. Next two categories to go over are melee weapons and ranged weapons. Now these are different because they are distinct types of items and are listed as such and do not have much to do with attacks in general. The type of attack you are making does not change the fundamental definition of the item. Again, these are items with specific subset definitions. As seen, hand axe is a melee weapon, listed that way, longbow is a ranged weapon, listed that way, and darts are a ranged weapon as well, listed that way. Throwing a hand axe in a ranged attack does not make it a ranged weapon. It is still defined as a melee weapon and will always be classified as such. Now, the next two things to go over are melee weapon attacks versus ranged weapon attacks. A melee weapon attack is a melee form of a weapon attack, not a melee weapon space attack. The phrase is melee added on to the aforementioned weapon attack. This is very important to keep in mind. Similarly, ranged weapon attacks are ranged space weapon attacks, not ranged weapon attacks. This is important because throwing a hand axe or a javelin is a ranged weapon attack with a melee weapon. This comes in handy when you look at rage proficiency added to damage from the Barbarian Rage feature, which requires a melee weapon attack, so it does not apply with throwing a hand axe because it's not a melee weapon attack, even though it is a melee weapon. Archery fighting style requires a ranged weapon as well, so it does not apply with a hand axe or javelin. Because again, these both require, in the first case, an attack in melee with a weapon attack, and the archery requires a ranged weapon, neither of which applies to throwing a hand axe or javelin. Finally, we have attacks with melee weapons versus melee weapon attacks. Just as we saw before, these are very different, and importantly, melee weapon attacks do not have to be made with a weapon. Weapon attacks, as we went over earlier, I told you to keep in mind, do not always involve weapons, keely in the form of unarmed strikes, because unarmed strikes in 5e are not weapons, and they do not account as attacks with melee weapons. However, they are melee weapon attacks, because melee weapon class does not involve a weapon, as we went over earlier. So, this comes in important, because the Battlemaster Maneuver Brace and other features require melee weapons, and they cannot be used without wielding an item that is under the melee weapon category. Unarmed strikes, if you're trying to unarmed fight, you cannot use the Battlemaster Maneuver Brace or other features that specifically require melee weapons or attacks with a melee weapon. The Battlemaster Maneuver Disarming Strike, however, requires a weapon attack and thus can be used with an unarmed strike because weapon attacks do not require weapons. So, the big question that always comes up is Paladin Divine Smites with unarmed attacks, because Jeremy Crawford and some other people have always said that no, it does not work. So, let's go over this entire situation in the wording with what we now know. Starting at 2nd level, when you hit a creature with a melee weapon attack, you can expend one spell slot to deal radiant damage to the target, in addition to the weapon's damage. So, we know that unarmed strikes are melee weapon attacks, but they are not weapons. So, for the first sentence, the first part of that sentence, unarmed strikes do satisfy the when condition, but it does get confusing when it says in addition to the weapon's damage, since there is no weapon doing damage. The interpretation of Jeremy Crawford is that Divine Smite requires weapon damage, and therefore requires a weapon, because it says in addition to the weapon's damage. If it was phrased in addition to any weapon damage, it would be fine, because it would just be 0. But since the wording calls out the weapon's damage, it can be interpreted that a weapon is needed. This is the interpretation used that people use to disallow divine smites from unarmed strikes. However, again, you can feel free to interpret this as any way you want. You can say that that's just a little funky wording on the end, and that the melee weapon attack is the main requirement of Divine Smite. And as many DMs have said, and Jeremy Crawford has said, it doesn't really impact the balance of the game. So overall, you can interpret this as you wish and roll it how you wish. And that is pretty much all we have to cover today. Again, thank you for coming, and class is dismissed.